Welcome back to Area DMG. I'm your host, Philip Wesley, the Mile High Mouth, and for today's episode, Asuki Nihan, we're reviewing the first episode of the only season of The Legend of Zelda. I know. You've seen tons of videos where they're like, "Oh, it's awful! Oh, it's awful! I'm wearing glasses and I'm telling you it's awful!" Or, I'm wearing glasses and drinking terrible beer and I'm gonna spend 30 minutes just cussing about how awful this is. But I've always thought was interesting about those reviews. They never do episode by episode. We do episode by episode because you can't be all like, "It's all bad," without actually giving any objectivity to it. There's a difference between bias and actually reviewing something. So we're doing that. This first episode is called The Ringer. Well, let's see. I have notes. Notes. I know, it's like a teleprompter. There's just so much to go over. I have actually fairly long notes on this. Anyways, the first episode is called The Ringer. You see, every Friday, back in the 1980s, late 1980s, on the Super Mario Super Show, there was a Legend of Zelda episode. So about 15 to 20 minutes of Legend of Zelda action, in between weird live action sequences with Lou Albano and other person. Anywho, Green Mario. Anyways, there's 13 episodes of the show, and I'm going to go through all 13 of them. Well, not right now, but just this one right now, and then there'll be about 13 episodes of this, and we'll put it all into a playlist so you can suffer through them on your own, or suffer through them with me, or actually take a better perspective on them and take an actual look at these, especially in the context of the 1980s. You see, life in Hyrule is peaceful until Link wakes up. But thankfully, he has his friends to help him through. He keeps Hyrule safe from Ganon, who wants to collect the Triforce of Wisdom to conquer the land. Yes, life would be simple for Link without these adventures, and life would be simple for Ganon without The Legend of Zelda. Anyways, a few notes. When we start up, Link is sleeping, and he sleeps without pants and with his sword under his pillow. Okay then. Anywho, the animation is done, I think, in part of it's done in Korea. Yeah. Anyways, going into this, I actually had something. I have a little bit of note here, right, about how the animation is actually not bad. It's fairly typical for that time period. The some of the little action sequences don't make sense until you put them into the context of how action sequences were done back in the 80s. If you go look at some older Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fights, there's like stuff where they're kicking off walls and things, and there's no reason for it, no tactical reason for it, except that it looks cool. You see, nobody knew how to really do good fight choreography and animation. We do what we could with what you can, with what you have. And the fight sequences are actually pretty decent. There's a lot of sound effects and music that are straight from the game, including a few original compositions that are actually quite good. The voice acting isn't as terrible as people would say. It's you have some issues like with Ganon monologuing a little bit, but he's no worse than, say, the Cobra Commander or Megatron or every 1980s villain. I mean, the Shredder has all sorts of times where he's just monologuing or giving useless directions to things and just gaps of logic. The writing is about on par with early 1980s and late 1980s and some 1990s stuff. Hell, it's better written than many shows today. Sorry. There's a bunch of shows there, animated shows that are out there that they don't really have a coherent plot. Basic coherent plot in this one is that, well, Link wakes up, he's guarding the Triforce of Wisdom, Ganon wants the Triforce of Wisdom, and because Ganon has the Triforce of Power, Link has to stop him from doing that. However, here's what happens in this episode. After fighting off some before fighting off some moblins, Link wakes up. He's looking out his window. Zelda's out there. She just woke up. She's hanging out on her balcony, and he's all like, "Oh hey, hey!" He whistles at her, which, well, he kind of catcalls her, and she calls him out on that. One thing I have to state is that Zelda is not a quote damsel in distress in this. She's very much an active part of this, and Link is kind of useless without her in most of these. So there is that, which is actually pretty progressive for a 1980s cartoon. Anyways, he teases Zelda and then gets attacked by some moblins. He fights off the moblins, and then we're shown Ganon, who's got like this really awesome like jar where he keeps all the enemies. Oh, when Link beats the enemies, he gets a little bow and he puts it in his bag, which is like a bag of holding, and that everything he pulls out of it, like his sword, his shield, etc., instantly shrinks down when he puts it in the bag. And that's kind of cool. That makes sense. It actually makes sense. Anywho, there's apparently an amateur magician's contest in Hyrule at that time. Ganon decides, I'm going to join in on that and see if I can distract Link so I can get the Triforce. That's not a bad idea. It's not a bad plan. And there's a couple action sequences, and Link and Zelda save the day. There are some strangely awkward moments, though, in this particular animation. There's parts where there's dialogue said and lips are not moving. Or random things where there's stuff that's said or might be said, but there's a little bit of extra parts where characters are saying something but obviously not saying something, or saying something and they're not moving. That's just animation quality at that time. It just happens. It's an error. The thing though that gets me though is that the way this is built out there's some really nice backgrounds, the animation's pretty decent, character designs are decent, but there's parts where a character will make a joke and then the camera will linger just a little bit longer than it should. Kind of like, of course. Yeah, that happens. That type of stuff happens. I do want to state though that it's kind of interesting how many of these voice actors are actually veteran voice actors. For example, a lot of them are from this Canadian cartoon called The Raccoons. In fact, the majority of the people here in this particular show are from our neighbors to the north, the Great White Canada, or whatever you call it. Strange brewing up there. Anywho, I don't know what that's about. There's just a lot of these people. They're all veterans. Sprite, the little fairy character that occasionally hits on Link and makes kind of inappropriate innuendo occasionally. She's voiced by, I think at the time she went by a slightly different name, but her name she goes by now is Tabitha St. Germain, who many people will know from practically a ton of stuff these days. Her biggest stuff right now is like people who are fans of My Little Pony will know her as Rarity or Princess Luna from that. And then she's in a ton of things. She's one of those people who you'll hear like characters in a video game or whatnot. It's probably her. It's probably her, or well, yeah, she's one of those voice actors who's continued to work way over the way like, you know, they always get work, and that's cool. Some of the other people there, like the guy that does Ganon, is also the voice of Bert the Raccoon in The Raccoons. His name was Len Carlson, and he died, I think, in like 2006 of a sudden heart attack and complications involving that. So that's sad. Anywho, The Ringer basically put it's a decent episode. There's some decent action to it. Not too many terrible puns. In fact, there's no puns in it. There's well, about a couple instances of that "excuse me, princess" catchphrase, but is "excuse me, princess" any worse than "eat my shorts" or other horrible catchphrases from the 1990s and 1980s? Cowabunga. Indeed. Nowadays we've got like "slam a cow" or I don't know. There's character catchphrases are intended for merchandising or to, quote, endear the character to us, but that doesn't really work that well with Link. It's kind of a bad catchphrase, and he comes off as being he comes off as being selfish, whereas Zelda herself comes off as being, actually, to be perfectly honest, she's one of the better characters in this show. Ganon comes off as being severely incompetent. I mean, he's got all this power, but he's kind of incompetent. Kind of like, okay, you can teleport yourself around things. Why don't you teleport yourself into places? But anyways, he goes and he pretends to be a wizard in this little contest, and then sabotages the contest by making a dragon out of a lizard that one of the other magicians materialized. And Link defeats it pretty well. Zelda helps him with that, though. I've noticed that in most of this particular episode, there's a dynamic between Link and Zelda that makes sense. Also, the Triforce of Wisdom and the Triforce of Power both talk, which was not a thing they did in The Legend of Zelda or The Legend of Zelda 2 Adventure Link. This is something that happened or was added more for The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. So, parts and bits of this are actually more canon and lore than people would expect. It's actually fairly accurate, and some of the things they have in it were added later on. Overall, not too bad. I know that this show gets a lot of bad rap, but this first episode's fairly watchable. The Ringer, as this episode is called, the Ringer is somebody who's really good at something, or a pro pretending to be an amateur. Overall, it's not a terrible episode. If I were reviewing it, I would probably give it like maybe a B, because it's not a bad episode. The animation's fine. There's only a few errors and some sound errors. The music is fine. The locales and the backgrounds are well done. The show just looks okay. It looks good. I could easily turn this on a Saturday morning and be fine. It doesn't look any worse than many of the cartoons of its time, and it doesn't look like spectacularly better than many of the cartoons of its time. This is just okay. And in comparison to Super Mario Super Show, it's a little bit more grounded in reality. It's not as squash and stretch as Super Mario Super Show is. There are some parts where things are the wrong size, but that's what you find in a lot of traditional animation. You'll find frames where things are not always perspective corrected properly. But hey, aside from those, it's not a bad episode. So far, it's not a bad series. It's just not what people wanted at the time. People were like, well, people have kind of built up their own expectations for The Legend of Zelda after Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, where they expect the Legend of Zelda series to be extremely serious. But you go and play through like The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, or Minish Cap, or Triforce Heroes, the new one, and the Legend of Zelda series is pretty goofy. It's got a goofy aspect to it and a bit of humor to it, and it's okay for that series to have humor. And I think the problem is, a lot of people went into this expecting it to be epic Lord of the Rings, but they say that when they've never watched the old animated series devoted to like Dungeons and Dragons or Dragon's Lair, or the old animated The Chronicles of Narnia, or some of there are weird musical numbers in The Hobbit, in the animated ones. This is, as far as fantasy stuff goes, it's not Record of Lotus War, but it doesn't have to be. So, yeah, I think it's a decent thing. I thought the episode was pretty decent. I guess on to the next episode. Have you seen this episode recently? Do you have any comments about the Legend of Zelda animated series? Go ahead and tell us below in the comments. Hit that like button if you haven't already, and hit that subscribe button if you're not subscribed to us yet. And until the next video comes out, you are now caught up.